these companies are saying, well, if this doesn't pass, we're going to have to shut down our operations here in California. And the reality is they need to figure out how to make their business work in California. All right, you're listening to the Brown Perspective. This is your host, Eduardo, and I'm here with my co-host, the one and only RO.
¿Cómo estamos? How we doing?
Doing well. We're 10 days before the election. Early voting started here in California. But before we get into a conversation about the dozen ballot initiatives on the ballot and how to become an informed citizen and an informed voter, we want to first thank and give a shout out to our subscribers. For those who just subscribe to our YouTube channel as well as our other social media channels. Thank you so much for joining us. It's great that you found our last conversation around James Olmos telling. So we're hoping to continue this dialogue with you, not only on political issues but other cultural issues that we want to discuss and bring the brown perspective on.
That's right. Welcome aboard. And as you mentioned earlier, we want to devote this episode today to the election, especially here in California. There's always the propositions that people have to go through apart from the presidency and then the other local elections. And we want to help guide people to find the resources that they need to make informed decisions. So we've collected today at least two different websites that offer pretty helpful information, quite good actually. But just a disclaimer that this is a left-leaning progressive channel. So the websites that we will be mentioning here are progressive guides. So if you are someone that considers yourself progressive, then these could help you make an informed decision.
That's right. And I know that there's other resources out there. I know that Ballotpedia also offers some good information on the candidates, on the ballots, as well as who are the main sponsors and supporters of a certain initiative. So I think, I know it's a lot of work, particularly when it comes down to the lesser known candidates at the local level for school district or judges that we have to vote on. But, it's part of being an informed citizen, trying to inform ourselves the best we can to make sure we make the right choices.
Yeah, so having said that, let's go over these two briefly so that we can guide people to make the quick decisions, and then we can go more in depth into the breakdown that they have for the races or even for the propositions. So the first one that I'm showing here is LA Forward. This one was actually founded by someone that I know. I met him through a buddy of mine who got a PhD. He got his PhD from USC, and I was at an event with him, and I ended up meeting him there, and I stayed in touch with him. And
Go Trojans!
Yeah, and he founded this nonprofit to focus on local politics here in LA. So he's doing great work helping with community organizing, helping with rent protections and issues around affordable housing. He was also big into the legalizing selling on the sidewalk for food vendors. And other local issues, especially like around elections and raising awareness about politics here in LA. So they have a really nice voter guide that you can go to. If you just go to their website, you can Google LA Forward, go to their voter guide. What they do is they give you a really nice breakdown right here. So if you're someone that's looking for a quick progressive guide for how to vote on these measures, then you have here the ones that they're recommending for yes, and then the ones that they're recommending for no. And if you want to see more detailed breakdown of their progressive guide, you can download the full guide. So I do want to spend some time talking about some of these propositions. But before we do that, let's just briefly cover here what they're recommending for yes versus no. And as always, we recommend for people to do their own research, not to just come to a website like this and do what somebody else is recommending. But we also understand that sometimes people might be pressed for time. They may not have the ability to really sit down and study all these measures. So if you just want a guide that is progressive and you consider yourself progressive, so you're getting something that you're likely to agree with if you just follow these recommendations, right?
Yeah, I guess if you're the opposite end of the spectrum, then you can see what they're voting yes on and what they're voting no on, and then you can make your decision on that too.
Right. So the yes recommendations here are for the LA County Measure J, LAUSD Measure RR, Proposition 15, which is the closing a corporate tax loophole, Proposition 16, removing ban on affirmative action here in California, Proposition 17, restore voting rights to people on parole, Proposition 18, give voting rights to 17-year-olds under certain circumstances, and then Proposition 21, amending the Costa-Hawkins Act to allow cities to create stronger tenant protections, and then Proposition 23, regulate dialysis clinics. So all those are yes. On the no side, it's Proposition 14, which is issuing bonds to fund California Institute for Regenerative Medicine. Proposition 19, enable transfer of residential property tax assessments. Proposition 20, reverse criminal justice reforms and increase spending on incarceration. Proposition 22, create loopholes in employment law for big tech. And Proposition 24, amend consumer privacy law. And then Proposition 25, as they point here, is your call. They really couldn't find a strong argument for or against. There's pros and cons depending on how you vote. So they're leaving that up to the voters.
That's interesting because I thought that was a fairly straightforward, progressive proposition in terms of, letting the revised law stand. But that's interesting.
It's not as simple because one of the arguments that you'll hear against it is that it could end up creating another industry that is as problematic, and it could end up putting a lot of power at the hands of the judges.
That's their job, no? I mean, that's why we have the justice system, and the judges who are supposed to have the discretion to make those type of calls.
Yeah, so why don't we can get a little bit more into this one then, because we can actually highlight the full guide here, and we can go to Proposition 25 for the case for and the case against. And I did also want to talk a little bit about the one for the gig economy.
Prop 22?
Yeah, so I think that one's a big one as well. I know there's others here that we can mention, but before we get into the full guide, I also want to pull up this other website, se llama California Progressive Voters Guide. And I came across this one last week. And this one was actually really useful as well because this one here is just giving you the recommendations on the propositions. But I needed help with getting information about the local elections, who's running in my district and who the judges are, and then who's running for board and community colleges. So if you come to this website, California Progressive Voter Guide, you click here, it will ask you if you want to detect your location automatically if you're on a phone, or you can just look up by address. So here what we'll do is we'll do 200 South Los Angeles, California. We'll just put that, and it's going to customize it based on where you're located. And after it does that, it may ask you additionally to locate your district. Now, the district is something that you can look up, or if you already have your ballot, if you're voting by mail, in that ballot, it will ask you, you'll likely see options to pick a candidate for a specific district, and that's going to be the district that you're a part of, so you can just select it. So in this case, I'll select District 4, just as an example. And it will load up. So as you can see here, we have Los Angeles Community College Board, trustee seat number 1. If you go down here, the seat number 3 for the community college, seat number 5. There's a few seats for the community college. Then this is LAUSD board member district number 3. And then there's also, let me just do a quick search for judge. It also has the judge of the Superior Court for positions, and it gives you, again, their recommendation and a brief explanation as to why they are voting for that candidate. They're not going to give you a detailed breakdown of all of the other candidates that are running. So that was a bit unfortunate because I did want to read more about the other candidates and get more information about them instead of just getting the recommendation and getting the pros. But they do give you some hints as to why they chose this candidate over, say, another candidate. For example, in one of the races that I saw, they were saying they recommended a certain candidate, and they said, we're recommending this candidate because the other candidate has ties to this other district that has had a history of investigation and corruption and just sketchy stuff going on in that district. So that's why we're not recommending that candidate. We're recommending this one among other reasons why. And so I found that really useful.
Yeah, and I know that the other tool that I know, Voters Edge, I think it's called, that is done by the League of Women Voters, does provide some information on other candidates. So to your point, I think similar format, you put in your address and then it generates the list too.
So I think this is a Santa Monica zip code that I put in. So it's just giving you, yeah, you're right. Yeah, this is useful too.
There's my guy, Rocky de la Fuente,
Oh, right
for
here.
president right there, baby. The next president of these United States.
Okay, so now that we covered at a high level where these guides are, let's jump a little bit here into the propositions. I'm really curious to get your take on this one, on their pros and their cons. And it also, when I was going over this, it sounded like you may not have agreed with one of these being a no. Was it the one, Proposition 19?
14.
14?
14, yeah, because that's about STEM research.
Yeah.
So I'm surprised that that a progressive organization wouldn't think that STEM research is something that we would want to do.
Yeah, I read these before, and there are cases that stem cell research has not actually delivered on the, or lived up to the promise that it was going to bring about this amazing leap in medical advancement. And so, and also that there's some other issues with providing funding for it, where I think they're saying that we could be allocating those funds to other areas that actually could have an impact, as opposed to researching something that in theory could help us, but to this day has not generated any results. But instead of me telling you that, let's go through the guide so we can see the actual somebody that put a lot more time putting this together.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I will highlight that you can tell so much about where the group stands by how they frame the propositions, right? So even descriptions up top, the word that they use, I think that, that in some ways is a hint to let you know what they're where they are in the political spectrum.
Right. So this proposition would issue 5.5 billion for stem cell research to be administered by the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine. While stem cell research is important, it's not clear that this line of study is more worthy of dedicated funding than other forms of basic scientific and medical research. Stem cell-based treatments haven't lived up to high expectations. No widespread treatments have emerged after $3 billion in spending, nor has the state earned royalties for the commercialization of treatments as was promised in 2004. So that's just one of the reasons why. What do you make of that?
That's interesting, and I seem to recall that when our President 45 got treatment, I know that he was getting some criticism because some of the experimental treatments that he was able to take advantage of took advantage of stem cell research, which I know is opposed by some in the right. But yeah, I think they make an interesting point, and it's the kind of situation where obviously I don't know enough about the state of stem cell research to even make an informed decision on it. But but I do also understand that it takes time, it takes investment for that research to be conducted, and then more importantly to have that research be translated into practical uses and things that could benefit us in the long run.
Right. The likely benefit of Prop 14 isn't good enough to justify 7.8 billion of the public billion the public will ultimately shell out. So they feel that the money could be used in a better way somewhere else. And but again, look, this is a guide again for people. That's why they give this information. If you read this and you agree with it, then you can vote as they're voting. But if you don't, then you can always vote yes for it because you believe that stem cell research is important. But I thought that they provided at least a good justification why.
Yeah, I do agree. And I think it does give me more information about their reasoning and more things to think about.
Okay. There was another one that you had mentioned before to me as well.
Well, yeah, I think Prop 15 keep your eye on that because it tackles try to split the prop 13, which kind of changed how here in California, how taxes were collected,
Yep.
and it was one of the most successful campaigns. So right now you see a little bit of the history of Proposition 13 that was passed back in 1978. But yeah, so I think this Prop 15 is trying to separate the commercial interests and making sure that those folks who own industrial property, non-residential commercial property, pay a little bit more in taxes so that that money can go to local school systems as well as local governments for doing additional for the doing the services that we all need. So it'll be interesting to see how that comes out because in some ways Prop 13 has become like this holy grail here in California when it comes to taxes and propositions.
Right, and then here they say passing the Proposition 15 would generate an estimated 12 billion, which would then be allocated for funding for education. Opponents are claiming that it would negatively impact California's economy and businesses, although they always seem to claim that when taxes are going to be raised. This claim does not hold up scrutiny. In reality, only 10% of California's commercial and industrial property will generate 92% of Proposition 15 revenues. And then just the other one, the Proposition
22.
22. So what's your take on this one?
Yeah, this one's interesting because I am a Lyft and Uber user, so I do appreciate the service, but I know they're basically trying to um, overcome the law that was passed last year, AB 5,
Right.
and they're trying to, basically carve out their own um, their own classification. And yes, they're willing to throw in a little bit more into the mix, including giving paid leave, some unemployment benefits, some minimum wages. So it's interesting because I know it's Uber, Lyft, and a lot of the other app-based businesses that are really making a huge push and spending. I know, I think I saw over $200 million at least in promoting Proposition 22.
Yeah, and again, that red flag should go off when multi-billion-dollar companies that are valued in the billions are spending so much money trying to get a measure passed because they're looking out for their own interests.
Yeah,
Uh,
it's called it's exempts app-based transportation and delivery companies from providing employee benefits to certain drivers. Initiative statute classifies app drivers as independent contractors instead of employees and provides independent contractor drivers other compensation unless certain criteria are met.
right. So when you do a no vote, you are voting no to the exemption that they're trying to get to not label the employees to not label the workers as employees.
Correct.
Right. I've seen the ads and I've either television commercials or ads online, and they try to make it about convenience, right? That, oh, well, it people want to work during their own hours, during their own time. It's convenient
Hmm.
for them. But the real problem though is that it doesn't set a good direction for us if companies can start doing this, because at stake here are things like paid sick leave, workers' compensation, unemployment benefits, and minimum hourly wages, which they don't have to pay any of those if they classify the workers as independent contractors. So yeah, you're right. It could be a little more convenient for someone to say, I just want to work 8 hours today and as an independent contractor, and I have a full-time job somewhere else. But it's just as a policy that you want to enact for as a general policy, it's just long term, it does a lot more harm than good. Because if you start having other companies doing the same thing, then pretty soon the only options that are going to be available for people are going to be options where there's no paid sick leave, there's no workers' compensation, because other companies are going to try to do the same thing and label them as contractors.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think there's an opportunity, within the innovation that these companies could do is, yes, you can classify them as an employee, but you can also classify them as a part-time employee and give them some flexibility. So I think they're making and this is the other thing that these companies are saying, well, if this doesn't pass, we're going to have to shut down our operations here in California. And the reality is they need to figure out how to make their their business work in California. So I do yeah, this one's hard to read because there's also I mean, there's a driver perspective, but I know there's also a lot of drivers who are organized against this, and actually, it was a lot of their protests about the low pay and the lack of these benefits that one of the reasons why AB 50 was passed. But then there's the perspective of the consumer, right? So as a Lyft driver or as a Lyft user or Uber user, I mean, one thing right now we're not going anywhere, so it's kind of like to really appeal to that sense. But I think you also want to, as a Lyft user, you also want to keep your prices low. So I know that that's one concern that people have. Like, is this going to increase the price of Lyft? Is this going to increase the wait? I have to wait for a Lyft to get here once I start using the service again, even though I know that there's some people who are using it now, but obviously not as much as pre the pandemic.
Right, and they're calculating here that if it goes into effect, meaning that they don't get the exemption, then it would cost them an additional 3,625 per driver, which would then, if it gets passed on to the consumer, about $1.80 per hour to the customer. And so that's how much more people would be paying. One thing that I think about is that these companies came in and they undercut the cab industry. And that's why they
Yep.
were so successful, because they were a lot cheaper, but they were undercutting it. It wasn't like they were cheating, but they were skirting a lot of the obligations that the cab industry had already. And when a company, it like I said earlier, it might seem appealing to someone to say that I just want to be a contractor and get my money and work whatever hours I want and not have to worry about this. But if you can put a value on these other things, there's value in that, and that's really what they're not providing. They're not providing sick leave, they're not providing workers' compensation. And if you're thinking, well, I don't really care about that because I'm not sick or I don't need any of that, that's not the point. The point is that you have that safety there, and you want
Yeah.
people, you want your fellow workers to have that safety as well in case they need it. And this is how these companies are able to make so much money, because they can get around these things. And even if the prices go up, that just means that the playing field will be a little bit more competitive now, maybe for cabs as well. I don't know if they'll be as expensive as cabs, but maybe cabs, it'll give them a fighting chance so that the cab industry doesn't go completely out of business. And I don't think I don't think they would stop operating here in California. The market is just way too big. They're complaining that they're going to get pushed out, and that customers are going to lose a great convenience. If Uber and Lyft move out of California, another company that does ride sharing will step in and take over.
Hmm.
They're not going to leave.
Yeah.
Don't let them
Yeah. I mean,
scare you.
the bottom line is they're going to need to adjust
Yeah.
their practices, and I think within and they make a good point. I think that there are people out there who just want to work a few hours a day, just to have a little extra to save for whatever it is that they want to save, whether it's their kids, a vacation, additional expenses. And then, but the problem is that there's a lot of people who have lost their jobs and have come to rely on Uber and Lyft, and it has become their full-time job. And oftentimes they feel they need to work long hours in order to make a decent living, and then that impacts safety because they're driving tired, they're driving
Hmm.
when they shouldn't. So the bottom line is, hopefully we'll get at a place where, yes, we can, people who want to work for Lyft and Uber or the other apps can do so, but that they're being compensated fairly, and that we as consumers are paying fairly too.
Yeah, it's a slippery slope, like I mentioned earlier. If you let these companies be exempt from this, other companies will try to do it as well. And pretty
Yep.
soon, if these are the only options that people have for jobs, then it won't be, "Yeah, I have a full-time job where I get benefits and I want to do a few hours driving for Lyft and Uber just to make some money on the side." It's going to be, "I have this job that considers me a contractor and I only work 28 hours there, and I have to make up for those 20. I have to make up the other 12 or however many hours more they have to work driving for Lyft and Uber. So none of the companies will offer this because it's too tempting for companies not to try to do this if this becomes the norm. They
Yeah.
save so much money by not having to pay for workers' compensation, by not having to pay for sick leave, and the other things that we mentioned.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I feel that this is the second time California deals with a transportation related industry. Back in the day, it
Hmm.
was the railroad
Right.
industry, and they had a chokehold. I'm sorry,
Yeah.
chokehold on the state, and actually one of the reasons why the proposition system was put into place was as a way to circumvent the power and the influence that the railroad company and utilities company had up in Sacramento. And one of the reasons why we, as residents of California and voters in California, have this amazing opportunity and also this amazing burden to decide on all these issues. Um, but it's also, as we have seen by some of the propositions that we discussed, yes, these propositions can be things that a coalition of people or organizations work together to address unintended consequence that is impacting people, but it's also a mechanism that can be utilized and taken advantage of by moneyed interests in order to pass their agendas and also come up with a more favorable regulation scheme or something that really advances their ability to make money and get ahead of competitors.
Right. And before we wrap this up, I just wanted to quickly cover Proposition 25, which is the one that you were surprised that they're not leaning heavily in either direction.
Hmm.
And one of the reasons why is this one here. Progressive groups have split significantly over Prop 25. The strongest support has come from statewide organizations deeply worried about how a no vote on Prop 25 would reinforce the bail industry's political power and create a legal barrier to the abolition of cash bail. Progressive opposition to Prop 25 is concentrated in the LA region, where increasingly powerful coalitions like Justice LA are adamant that different and better legislation can be passed. These groups argue that far from improving the status quo, Prop 25 will entrench a risk assessment system that could be even more discriminatory than the current bail system, resulting in increased detention.
Interesting. Um, because I mean, the current system is just so fucked up, and then being afraid of, and I mean, certainly see their point, but I think that's something that could happen to any system. But hopefully now with the awareness that we have about the inequities and the discrimination, that people would be a little more vigilant about starting a system that's a little fairer.
Yeah, I think this right here is key right here to the reason why they're ambivalent about this. It says the risk assessment system proposed by SB 10 Proposition 25 doesn't take into consideration a person's individual circumstances or facts of the case. Instead, it uses data points like age and arrest record to determine a defendant's likelihood of missing their court date. So if that's all they're going at, then you can see how this new system could eventually end up discriminating against if they're just going based on data points. And then they've stripped away a person's ability to even post bail, and now it's just based on a decision that's saying, well, we think you're high risk of not coming back to court because you've had X many offenses in the past and you're this age group, so we're not going to let you out, so you have to stay in until your court date. So
Hmm.
this isn't a clear cut for me either. I did read this and I was leaning for it in some cases and against it. And I think finally what I kind of settled on was, well, the bail industry is supporting.
I thought the industry was asking people to vote no on this.
Right. The bail industry is asking for a no vote because they don't want to change to the current system.
Got it.
But that motivates me to want to vote yes, to give something new a try.
Yeah.
Even despite my reservations regarding this, because I know when I'm reading this to you, it makes it seem like I'm against this, but I'm also against the bail industry. So at the end, this is kind of a toss up for me as well. A determining factor for me would be, well, I'm not really sure which way to go on this because there's good and bad cases in either direction. So I'll just go against the bail industry and go for trying something new.
Yeah.
But I will try to spend more time on this. But again, look, all the information for people if they want to go through these propositions is here. Like I said, we don't have time to really dig into all of these and read the recommendations. So we encourage people to go out and do their own research and then make an educated vote.
And if all else fails, you can do the mini, miny, mo
That's right.
selection.
Okay. Entonces, los dejamos con estos. Any other words before we wrap this up?
No, this was informative. Thank you all, and please vote. If you live in LA County, you can vote. Start in person, starting today. I know we're seeing an uptick in the number of people who have returned their ballots already, so you can return them by the post office, Dropbox, or go in person now. So whatever you do, make sure that you exercise your right to vote. There's a lot of people who cannot. So let's take that responsibility seriously.
Okay, and if you like the content, don't forget to subscribe. Hit the bell button so you can get alerts as well. Follow us on Instagram as well as Twitter as well at Brown Perspective. Nos vemos.